everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning in for another episode. This is probably my favorite time of the year to fish if I happen to be in the southern part of the country. You've got a lot of fish that are starting to move into those spawning areas, or at least starting to stage in and around those spawning areas. So if you happen to live down in Texas or down in Florida, Alabama, places like that, when you start getting that water temperature that's pushing the upper 50s, especially on the main lake, and your spawning pockets are warming up into that 60-degree range, you can have some absolutely phenomenal fishing and have the opportunity at catching some of the biggest fish that live in that lake. So we're going to talk a little bit about the pre-spawn into spawn period with one of my favorite baits. These guys right here, I'm talking about your swimming worms, one of the most underutilized baits throughout the country, but in very small segments of the country, it's one of the most popular baits. So if you live in Florida, you probably know how good a swimming worm is. But if you happen to live, say, up in Wisconsin, it's not nearly as used as much as it should be, in my opinion. So we're going to talk a little bit about both of these, or all of these. Really what a swimming worm is a worm that's got your straight body and then small kicker tail on the end. The most popular one, or the one that kind of created a lot of the craze, is this guy right here. This is the Zoom speed worm. Just got their standard little cut tail on the end. It does come in a bunch of different sizes. So this is the Magnum, and then it's got, like, this is the standard size. I think there's one or two other sizes. And then you've got something like this guy right here. This is the Berkley Speed Boss. This is one of the ones that I really like to use as well. It comes in a various different sizes. I will tell you one thing that I really like about the Speed Boss is, depending on water clarity, I can pull one of these tails off if I want. So if I want to have something that's a little bit more streamlined, I'll remove a tail. If I'm fishing water that's got a little bit more color to it, or maybe tannic stained, then a lot of times I'll just leave both kickers. But both of these are really good. One key thing to point out a lot of times with your swimming worms is that they are pretty massy in terms of the body. So it's a straight body. A lot of times they've got a little bit more bulk. And then just the small kicker tail, like I said. The biggest difference between this and, say, a traditional power bait or a power worm, 7-inch power worm, is that mass. And a lot of times that just has to do with the fact that you're fishing these through heavier cover. If you had a much skinnier, slender worm, they have a much greater tendency of sliding down the hook shank, balling up, and therefore not working that well. So the worms that have a little bit more mass tend to be better because they hold up better on the hook. And from that perspective, they just come through the cover better, and they don't lead to a lot of erroneous casts where the bait is just fouled. So from that standpoint, that's kind of what you've got. You can absolutely still use any form of ribbon tail worm if you want, but again, keep in mind that that mass is valuable. The other reason the mass is good too is because a speed worm can be fished on the top, and that mass helps keep the bait up on the surface, and therefore you can fish it kind of like a topwater bait. So from that standpoint, let's just kind of talk about some of the areas where, not the areas, but the ways how I love to fish this. The first, like I just mentioned, you can fish it on top. So if you happen to be on a place that's got a lot of vegetation that comes to the surface, or maybe you've got a lot of debris in the water, sometimes that's leaves, sometimes it could be in the spring grass clippings. It really does work well as a topwater bait where you can retrieve this right over the surface, almost like a very finessey buzzbait style bait. Very, very popular down in the Florida area where you've got a lot of spawning pockets and spawning bays where maybe you've got some mixture of some submerged and emerged grasses, and you just want to cover a bunch of water. This is one of the best ways to go about doing that. Another way that I love to fish it, and this is one of the best tournaments I had a couple of years ago where I finished 5th at the Harris Chain of Lakes, was to fish it a little bit more like a traditional worm where I put a bullet weight in front of it, and then but I left it unpegged, and then I kind of let it fall to the bottom. I was fishing a grass flat, fell to the bottom, 5-6 foot of water, and then I just kind of stroked the bait, and that would get the bait to explode off the bottom. But then when I finished the end of that stroke, the weight would separate, fall to the bottom, and my worm would just kind of fall down nice and slow. So it was kind of like a reactionary finesse type approach that worked extremely well in that event. I caught a pile of big fish. Like I said, I finished fifth. I think I had, I'm gonna say like 17 to 19 pounds every day doing it. It just worked extremely well in that situation. Another way I like to fish them is just dragging them on the bottom, so you don't have to keep that bait moving all the time. I have fished that on everything from like a wobble head to a Texas rig to a jig trailer, depending on the size. Now, I wouldn't necessarily throw the Magnum size in that case, but there, like I said, there's a lot of smaller size speed worms as well. So you kind of really can fish it in a lot of different manners. Very, very versatile bait. One of the keys here is I will say that they tend to perform better around vegetation. So whether that's emergent or submergent grasses, one of the keys is how well this comes through that cover. From a hook standpoint, generally speaking, I tend to use a traditional, uh, offset worm hook. You can use both a round bend or an O'Shaughnessy, which is a little bit more closed gap there. I personally like to go with the round bend generally. And one thing I want to point out here is the reason I prefer a straight offset worm hook over an EWG worm hook is because that EWG does not come through the grass quite as well. When you rig these up, it's a little bit more streamlined versus the EWG wanting to come out further. So if you're talking about bringing it through vegetation and bringing it through cover, the traditional worm hook, an offset worm hook, actually comes through better than an EWG. Doesn't mean you can't throw an EWG. There's just a slight advantage, in my opinion. And then again, depending on how you're fishing it, your weight could be a little bit different. If you're fishing it on the surface, a lot of people won't throw any sort of bullet weight on it. Some people will actually add, you can buy like little plastic bullet weights that add a little bit of weight, help protect the nose of the bait, help it come through cover, but doesn't add weight to drag the bait under. That's up to the user. Generally speaking, if I'm throwing a magnum size, uh, swimming worm, I don't need to add any weight from a casting standpoint. The Speed Boss here is a heavy plastic bait to begin with, so I don't need to add weight if I want to keep it on top. Generally, that's my opinion. If you are going with some of the smaller sizes, it may be a little bit more helpful to go with a little plastic. Um, it's not a weight, but a plastic uh, Texas rig or bullet weight that goes on the front just to help it come through cover. Again, that's up to the user and what you're doing with it. But generally speaking, I prefer to leave mine unpegged versus pegged. And there's a couple of reasons. One, if I'm fishing this bait, say on the surface, and I find a hole in the grass that I want to drop my worm into, a lot of times, again, when drop it in the hole, the weight will separate and you get a much slower natural fall out of the worm. So I like it from that standpoint. And then I also like it if I'm just swimming it underwater, because that's one of the best ways to fish it, is just swim it through submerged grasses. I tend to feel like I get better movement out of my bait with an unpegged worm. Now, if the cover is too thick, you may have to end up pegging it just to keep everything together. But generally speaking, because these worms are always moving, you're going to have that weight pushed up against the front of the worm anyways. Personal preference, I do feel like it helps me get a few extra bites from that standpoint. All right, so some of the best places to fish a swimming worm, like I mentioned earlier, your spawning flats are going to be a huge place. Your any sort of transition zone. So if you've got a lake with a bunch of grass on it, if you've got grass right outside of those spawning flats, that can be a great place to look. If you've got ditches that flow through some of those grass flats, that's a true traditional type migratory route. That is another phenomenal place to fish it. And then if you've just got some of those areas that warm quickly during the spring, so it could be a shallow, dark bottom bay, bunch of pads, bunch of cattails, those types of areas, they tend to really produce well. And the swimming worm is such a key for that because it allows you to cover a lot of water quickly. For me, it very much is a search bait. So I'm generally fishing a speed worm or a speed boss in a situation where I can make a lot of casts, a lot of long casts, cover a lot of water. Now, if I'm fishing or practicing for a tournament, I'm okay getting blowups and missing those fish. I'm really looking for an area that I know the fish are utilizing to spawn and to move into during the pre-spawn and spawn time. So from that standpoint, I'm just looking to generate a lot of bites. And that's what these guys do. They get a lot of bites. You can also generate some really big bites as well. It just seems like, especially from the bigger sizes, it's a really good bait at generating some very big females into biting. But it's all about covering water. Once I find an area where I've generated a lot of bites, at that point, I can determine whether or not fishing something like the speed worm is still the way to go, or maybe I want to slow down with a soft stick bait like a general and really kind of work through those areas in case the fish have actually moved on beds. But an absolutely dynamite springtime bait. Now, I also want to reiterate, it's not just a springtime bait. It is a very good year-round bait. If you're talking about any place that's got grass, you can fish it pretty much year-round. But it does tend to shine in that pre-spawn and spawn time period. So if you're not fishing swimming worms, guys, I really think you might want to pick up some. An absolute dynamite way to fish, especially if you have lakes that have a bunch of shallow spawning bays, where the fish just kind of move up into those bays. They tend not to work as well on lakes like the Ozarks region where you've got more stair-stepping type stuff that the fish spawn on. But if you've got lakes like a Gunnersville or down in Florida or down in Texas where you get a lot of shallow flooded cover, you're probably going to want to pick up some swimming worms. One of my favorites for this time of year, from now and through like until they start spawning up here in the north, so Mayish. It's one of the baits I'll have tied on. I'll have them tied on at Sandy Cooper coming up as well. Anyways, thanks for watching. If you have questions regarding swimming worms, put them in the comment section. Otherwise, if you enjoyed today's video, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Stay tuned, new video coming out tomorrow.